After Constantinople fell in 1453, the Christian world went on the defensive. Empires collapsed, kingdoms disappeared. For decades, it felt like history was moving in only one direction. But what if I told you that less than a century later, a Christian state didn't just survive, it went on the offensive? For the first time since the fall of Constantinople, a fully sovereign Christian power rewrote the balance of power by conquering and permanently absorbing a Muslim khanate. If you love thoughtful, evidence-based history, numbers, logistics, and the stories behind the maps, you're in the right place. This is an open community. Challenge the ideas, correct the mistakes, and share what you know. That's how this channel grows. Today, we're breaking down how that happened, why it mattered, and why it quietly changed the future of Eurasia more than most people realize. By the middle of the 16th century, the Golden Horde was dead. But in its place, 4 successor states emerged, not as heirs, but as rivals in a death match, all competing to claim legitimacy from what they called the Golden Lineage, the bloodline of Genghis Khan. Each inherited a piece of Mongol political culture, military tradition, and, hang on to most importantly, control over trade and movement across Eurasia. Among them, Kazan stood out. Founded in 1438, the Kazan khanate occupied one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in all of Eastern Europe, the confluence of the Volga and Kama rivers. If you picture medieval trade routes like arteries, this was a major junction where several of them crossed. From Kazan, merchants and caravans could move south toward Persia, west toward the Ottoman world, or east into Central Asia. Just as critically, Kazan sat at the gateway to the Ural Mountains, a region rich in furs, metals, and raw materials that early modern states desperately wanted. Control Kazan, and you controlled movement, money, and resources along the Volga. For Moscow, that was a nightmare. Under Ivan III, Moscow formally broke free from the so-called Tatar yoke in 1480. That moment is often framed as a clean break. In reality, it wasn't. Freedom from the Mongols came with a terrifying price tag. After 1480, Moscow realized a brutal truth. They had traded one great Khan for a smaller, hungrier one. The Kazan Tatars weren't distant overlords collecting tribute. They were right there, close, aggressive, and dangerous. Year after year, mounted Tatar raiding parties surged north into Russian borderlands. Villages were burned, fields were stripped bare, and worst of all, people were taken. Historical estimates suggest that tens of thousands of Russians were captured over the 15th and early 16th centuries and sold into slavery. Men, women, and children were marched south and east in chains, eventually ending up in slave markets across the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East. If you lived on Russia's frontier, it was a constant fear. And this is the part people sometimes miss. Slavery wasn't a side effect of the raids. It was a core economic engine. Human beings were a major export. Every successful raid weakened Moscow demographically and economically, while enriching Kazan and its trading partners. To survive, the Tsars had to play a dirty game, creating the khanate, a tame Mongol state, to hunt their own kin. It was Tatar against Tatar, brother against brother, all paid for by Moscow's gold. A perfect example is the Khanate, founded in 1452. It was a Muslim Tatar state, but loyal to Moscow. Why would a Russian ruler do that? Because even the Third understood something crucial. You fight the steppe best with steppe tools. Loyal Tatars were used to counter hostile Tatars. Mongol political logic repurposed. Fast forward to 1547. A young ruler named Ivan IV formally crowned himself Tsar of all Rus. That title mattered more than it might sound today. Tsar was derived from Caesar, and by adopting it, Ivan was making a bold claim. He was placing himself on the same symbolic level as Byzantine emperors and even the great Mongol Khans who had once ruled over Russia itself. Ivan was announcing a new kind of authority, absolute, centralized, and no longer hostage to the whims of powerful noble families, the boyars who had dominated Russian politics for generations. And Kazan became the testing ground. By the time Ivan IV came to power, the Kazan khanate was a decaying prize. Internally divided, politically unstable, constantly torn between factions aligned with Moscow and those backed by Crimea. It was no longer a question of whether Russia would move against Kazan. The only questions left were how and what kind of state Russia would become in the process. Ivan and his advisors looked at the map, looked at the numbers, and came to a hard conclusion. They wanted to erase it. Earlier campaigns against Kazan between 1547 and 1550 had failed, mostly for boring but deadly reasons: mud, distance, and supply. Kazan sat more than 400 miles from Moscow. That distance doesn't sound overwhelming on a modern map. Music. But in the 16th century, it might as well have been the edge of the world. Supplying an army that far from home meant hauling food, powder, shot, and spare equipment over primitive roads, through dense forests, and across rivers that froze solid in winter and turned into mud seas during the infamous Rasputa. An army could march out strong and confident, only to slowly starve, freeze, or bog down before ever reaching the walls. And that's exactly what happened. Ivan IV watched entire campaigns collapse, not because Kazan defeated them in battle, but because Russian forces simply couldn't stay in the field long enough. Every failed expedition burned money, music, morale, and political credibility. By 1550, it was painfully clear marching from Moscow every time was a losing strategy, so Ivan changed the game. Instead of trying to reach Kazan, he decided to move Russia closer to Kazan. In 1551, Ivan handed the problem to one of his most capable minds, the military engineer Ivan Verdov. What Verdov pulled off still sounds almost unbelievable. Hundreds of miles upriver at Uglich, Russian builders began constructing an entire fortress. Walls, towers, gates, barracks, even churches out of timber. But here's the trick. None of it was meant to stay there. Every beam was carefully cut, numbered, and designed to be taken apart. Once completed, the entire structure was dismantled, loaded onto massive river rafts, and floated down the Volga like a giant wooden puzzle. The destination was Lysia Hill, at the junction of the Sviaga and Volga rivers, just a short distance from Kazan itself. Once the materials arrived, the Russians reassembled the entire fortress in just 4 weeks. The result was Sevagek, a fully functioning forward base planted almost in Kazan's backyard. Svage was a living weapons depot, food stores, gunpowder magazines, artillery parks, barracks for thousands of soldiers. For the first time, Russian forces could stay in the region indefinitely, applying constant pressure instead of launching short, desperate campaigns. But logistics alone wouldn't win the war. With the help of a reformist circle known as the Chosen Council, Ivan pushed through the Sudnik of 1550, tightening state control and military obligations. But the real breakthrough was the creation of the Steltsy, Russia's first permanent professional infantry force. This marked a clean break from the old system, where military power rested almost entirely on noble cavalry and feudal obligations. Before this, Russian armies leaned heavily on noble cavalry and a rigid hierarchy system called Nichesto, where command was assigned by family rank, not skill. The Steltsy were something new. They were armed with arquebuses, early matchlock firearms that could punch through armor at close range. For close combat, they carried sabers and, most distinctively, the massive bardish, a long-handled axe with a huge crescent-shaped blade. The bardish was terrifying up close, capable of splitting shields and armor, but it also had another role. It doubled as a gun rest, stabilizing the heavy arquebus while firing. This mattered more than it sounds. Early firearms were slow, smoky, and awkward. Anything that improved accuracy and reload speed increased survival. Visually, the Stelzi stood out immediately. They wore standardized kaftans, bright red, blue, or green depending on their regiment, and tall caps, often paired with striking orange boots. In a military culture still dominated by irregular levies, this uniformed appearance sent a powerful message. These were professional soldiers, trained, paid, and expected to fight as a unit. Talented commanders were promoted over prestigious ones. Orders flowed cleanly. For the first time, Russia fought with something resembling a modern chain of command. That alone changed everything. The final march on Kazan began in June of 1552, and this time there was nothing tentative about it. Ivan IV came with what was, by 16th century standards, a monster. Contemporary estimates put the Russian army at around 150,000 men. To put that into perspective, that's larger than many entire European field armies of the period. Alongside them came about 150 heavy artillery pieces, most of them moved by river, floating downstream on barges because dragging cannons overland through forest and mud would have been painfully slow and destructive. One of the most surprising truths about the fall of Kazan in 1552 is who was actually fighting on Ivan IV's side. Most people picture a clean, simple story: Orthodox Russians versus Muslim Tatars. The army besieging Kazan was not ethnically pure at all. In fact, a significant portion of Ivan's forces were Tatar soldiers and commanders, and some historians argue there may have been more Tatars fighting for Ivan than defending the city itself. That idea alone forces us to rethink what this war really was. This wasn't just a religious or ethnic clash. It was a struggle inside the steppe political world. A key example is the khanate, a Tatar state allied with Moscow. Its cavalry units played a critical role as scouts and vanguards during the campaign. These riders knew the terrain, the music rivers, and the steppe routes far better than most Muscovite troops. They also served as intermediaries, communicating with local tribes and Tatar factions that were still undecided. Then there's Shigali, also known as Shig Ale. He was a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. Shigali had already sat on the throne of Kazan multiple times as a Moscow-backed ruler. In 1552, he personally took part in the siege on Ivan's side. That alone tells you this was a civil war layered on top of conquest. Even more striking is the role of the Merses, the Tatar nobility. At least 500 high-ranking Merses from Kazan defected to Moscow before and during the siege. They brought detailed knowledge of Kazan's defenses, where the walls were weakest, how the gates were structured, and how the city's internal systems worked. For these groups, loyalty was about survival, profit, and influence. Ivan IV represented stability and economic security, especially compared to the pro-Sich Crimean faction inside Kazan, which was closely tied to the Crimean Kate and, by extension, the Ottoman world. Choosing Moscow was a strategic calculation. In June 1552, just as Ivan was preparing to march east, the Crimean Khan, backed by the Ottomans, launched a major raid against Tula, deep inside Muscovite territory. The goal was obvious: force Ivan to abandon the Kazan expedition and rush south to defend his heartland. This was a classic strategic trap. And if Ivan panicked, the entire Kazan campaign would collapse before it even began. Instead, Ivan did something surprisingly calm. He split his forces. He sent a detached army under Princes Vorotinsky and Kaskai to meet the Crimeans at Tula while keeping the core of his army intact. The result was decisive. The Crimean force was crushed and thousands of Orthodox captives were freed. Just as importantly, Ivan's rear was secured. Only then did he commit fully to Kazan. Without that victory at Tula, the siege of Kazan never happened. That's how thin the margin really was. Late summer, the Russian war machine had arrived in full. By August 22nd, Russian forces had completed a full encirclement of Kazan. From the outside, it may have looked like the city was already doomed, but this was actually the most dangerous moment for the besiegers. The biggest threat didn't come from inside the walls. It came from the forests to the north and east. Tatar cavalry and Marichur's tribal fighters were hiding in dense woodland, striking suddenly and disappearing just as fast. Their leader, Yapancha, operated out of a stronghold at Asha, launching repeated raids against Russian camps, supply lines, and artillery positions. These weren't symbolic attacks. A single successful raid could burn powder stores, kill engineers, or end the siege. And for a brief moment, it looked like Kazan might survive after all. Ivan responded decisively. He ordered Prince Alexander Gorbaty-Shwysky to lead a sweeping counter-operation. Between August 30th and September 6th, Russian forces hunted Yapancha's units relentlessly. Cavalry clashes turned into running battles through forest clearings. Agra itself was stormed and burned to the ground. Thousands of warriors were captured or killed. When the smoke cleared, the message was unmistakable. No more relief was coming. Kazan was now completely isolated. With the outer threat eliminated, Ivan turned his attention to the walls themselves. Kazan's defenses were tougher than they looked. The city's fortifications weren't simple wooden palisades. They were thick timber walls packed with earth, designed specifically to absorb artillery fire. Russian cannons could damage them, but not crack them open quickly, so Ivan turned to engineering. Russian chronicles speak reverently of a mysterious figure named Rosmis, a word meaning something like the planner or the thinker. For centuries, he was treated as a near mythical character. Modern research strongly suggests Rosmisel was actually an English engineer named Butler, recruited through the newly formed trade connections of the Muscovy Company. Under his direction, Russian sappers began a quiet, deadly campaign underground. Their first target wasn't the walls, it was the water supply. By identifying and collapsing the underground channels that fed fresh water into the city, they forced Kazan's population to rely on shallow, contaminated wells inside the walls. The result was predictable. Disease spread rapidly among civilians and soldiers alike. Thirst weakened morale. Sickness weakened resistance. Then came the second task. Butler's teams dug deep tunnels beneath key sections of the fortress, especially under critical gates like Noi and Ataluk. These were carefully shored passages packed with explosives placed directly under the foundations. While the miners worked below ground, Ivan Verikov was busy above it, at the siege site itself. Russian engineers constructed something extraordinary. A 12 meters tall wooden tower built piece by piece right in front of Kazan's walls. The tower functioned as a mobile artillery platform. It could hold up to 10 heavy cannons and around 50 lighter guns stacked at multiple levels. Once pushed into position, it allowed Russian gunners to fire directly downward onto Tatar defenders along the walls, hitting positions that normal ground-level artillery couldn't reach. From the perspective of the defenders, it must have felt apocalyptic. Shots rained in from above. Parapets that once offered protection became death traps. Every attempt to man the walls brought immediate, overwhelming fire. The walls still stood, but the city was bleeding from every direction. Just before dawn on October 2nd, 1552, everything came to a head. While most of Kazan was still wrapped in darkness, Russian engineers finished packing enormous charges of gunpowder into the tunnels beneath the city walls. These were massive explosive loads, estimated at around 3.9 tons of gunpowder in total. In the 16th century, that was an almost unimaginable amount of explosive force concentrated in one place. At the exact moment the charges were ready, Ivan IV was attending prayers inside his mobile field church just outside the city. According to the chronicles, the timing was deliberate. Faith and firepower were meant to move together. Then the ground itself erupted. The explosion tore open a huge section of Kazan's wall, sending timber, earth, and stone flying into the air. The shockwave rolled across the battlefield where there had been a fortress seconds earlier. There was now a jagged, smoking gap wide enough for entire units to pour through. And they did. Strezzi infantry, backed by noble cavalry, surged into the breach. What followed wasn't a clean military collapse, it was brutal. Close-range fighting in narrow streets, courtyards and alleyways. Muskets fired at point-blank range. Bardish rose and fell. Cavalry dismounted to fight on foot where streets were too tight for horses. The defenders didn't break quickly. Tatar soldiers and civilians fought with the desperation of people who knew there was no escape. Even issued direct orders. Most of the male population was to be killed, and much of the Tatar city itself was to be destroyed. Mosques were torn down. Islamic libraries were burned. There's a chilling episode from the siege that captures the psychological intensity of the moment. Ivan ordered captured Tatar prisoners to be tied to wooden stakes near the city walls. He threatened to execute them unless Kazan surrendered. The defenders responded by firing arrows, not at the Muscovite army, but at their own people. To them, death was preferable to falling into the hands of the unbelievers. One of the most powerful moments came at the city's main mosque. Kol Sharif, the spiritual leader of Kazan, refused to flee. He and his students fought and were killed on the steps of the mosque itself, turning the site into a symbol of both resistance and tragedy. By the end of the day, organized defense had collapsed. The Khan Yadigar Muhammad was captured alive. Later, he would be forcibly baptized into Orthodox Christianity and given the name Simeon, a symbolic transformation meant to show that Kazan had not only been conquered, but spiritually subdued. But the cost was horrific. The fall of Kazan was followed by mass slaughter and systematic destruction. Large parts of the city were leveled. Nearly all major Islamic religious buildings were destroyed. Ibn Tefetith ordered the entire Muslim population expelled from the city and replaced with Russian settlers, permanently reshaping the region's demographic and cultural landscape. From a modern perspective, it's impossible to separate the military success from the human catastrophe that followed. Tens of thousands were killed or displaced. Kazan survived, but only as a conquered city. Even with all those Tatar allies fighting at his side, even the Fyoth was very careful about how the victory at Kazan was framed and what it was meant to mean. Once the city fell, he leaned hard into Orthodox Christianity as a tool of mobilization, justification, and power. Ivan IV framed it as a holy victory. Using religious language and symbolism, the campaign was cast as a kind of orthodox crusade against unbelievers. This fit perfectly into a growing ideological framework known as Moscow to Rome. The idea was simple but powerful. Rome had fallen. Constantinople, the second Rome, had fallen to the Ottomans in 1453. That left Moscow as the last true guardian of Orthodox Christianity. By conquering a former Muslim khanate and forcibly integrating it into a Christian empire, Ivan strengthened his claim as not just a king, but a divinely sanctioned ruler, a czar on par with emperors and khans alike. To seal the message in stone, Ivan ordered the construction of St. Basil's Cathedral on Red Square. Its official name, the Cathedral of the Intercession of the Theotokos, was no accident. Kazan fell on the feast day of the Virgin Mary's protection. Each colorful dome of the cathedral symbolized a saint whose feast day aligned with key moments of the campaign. On the domes of newly built Orthodox churches in and around Kazan, a striking symbol appeared, the crescent moon placed beneath the Christian cross. To modernize, it's easy to miss how explosive this was. The crescent was widely recognized as an Islamic symbol. Placing it literally underfoot sent a message that didn't need translation. Later, theologians would try to soften this. Some argued the crescent was the Byzantine Sada, or even the moon beneath the feet of the woman from the Book of Revelation, symbolizing the Virgin Mary. But whatever later interpretations claimed, the meaning in 1552 was painfully obvious to everyone involved. And that's where most history books stop. For the people of the Middle Volga, October 2nd, 1552 wasn't an ending. It was the first domino. Just 4 years later, Russia captured Astrakhan with little resistance. In one move, Moscow controlled the entire Volga from its upper reaches to the Caspian Sea. The northern slave route was shut down. Steppe elites who had lived off raiding lost a major source of income. Some adapted, others submitted. The system itself never recovered. That alone reshaped Eurasian commerce. But the loss of slave labor didn't end coercion. It pushed it inward. To stabilize his economy, Ivan tightened serfdom at home. Peasants were bound more firmly to the land. Mobility shrank, and a system that would hold Russia back for centuries took deeper root. Kazan ended one brutal economy and helped entrench another. At the same time, Russia gained something enormous: control over the Middle Volga, one of the key arteries linking Europe to Asia. Kazan sat at the crossroads of river routes connected to the northern branches of the ancient Silk Road. By destroying the Kazan khanate, Russia removed the biggest obstacle to eastern expansion. Powerful merchant families like the Stroganovs suddenly had a clear path beyond the Urals. In 1582, Kazakh forces financed by Stroganov, money pushed into Siberia. What began as a frontier raid became the start of Russia's transformation into a transcontinental empire. You might expect Moscow to wipe the slate clean and impose a brand new Russian administration on the Volga region. That's not what happened. Instead, Ivan created something called the Kazan Palace Office, effectively Russia's first colonial ministry. Rather than inventing new systems, Moscow reused Mongol ones: taxation, census records, and the Ayasik tribute paid in furs or goods. This flexibility allowed Russia to govern diverse peoples like the Chuvash, Mari, Morvin, and Bashkir with limited resources. That administrative adaptability, borrowing from the Mongols rather than erasing them, is one of the quiet reasons Russia was able to hold such a vast, diverse territory with relatively limited resources. But while Moscow was consolidating the Volga, the shockwaves were being felt much farther south. To the Islamic world, especially the Ottoman Empire, Kazan was a warning siren. Sultan Selim II and his Grand Vizier Sakolmed Pasha immediately grasped the danger. If Russia controlled the Volga, the next step was obvious: access to the Black Sea and from there the Mediterranean. So in 1569, the Ottomans decided to act. They launched a massive expedition to retake Astrakhan and dig a Don-Volga canal, hoping to sail from the Black Sea into the Caspian. On paper, it was visionary. In reality, it collapsed. The ground was too hard, only a third of the canal was dug, and a Russian raid shattered the workforce. During the retreat, winter and Circassian attacks killed roughly 70% of the Ottoman force. That failure in 1569 settled the issue. Russia was now the uncontested master of the Volga basin. Crimean raids would continue for decades, yes, but strategically the balance had shifted for good. By taking the Yokid throne, Ivan gained something Moscow had always lacked: recognition as a sovereign king by Western standards and as a supreme Khan by Eastern ones. He bridged both worlds. From that moment on, the road to Siberia and the Pacific lay open. What had once been a forest-bound principality began its transformation into the largest state on earth, and that's why St. Basil's Cathedral looks the way it does. Those colorful domes aren't just decoration. They echo Tatar tents, steppe shrines, and Islamic architecture, frozen into stone in the heart of Red Square. And this created a new reality Moscow had never faced before. That mix of accommodation and coercion would define Russian imperial policy for centuries.